Hey, welcome to the Socialist Shelf. And we are really excited today to have an interview with a man that I know a lot of our listenership has already read, definitely read a lot of his books, listened to some of his interviews. We have Vijay Prashad. He's executive director of the Tricontinental Institute, prolific writer, written books such as Washington Bullets, recently wrote The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of U.S. Power. How are you doing today, Vijay?
What a day. What a day.
Yeah.
I just came to you after recording a show with Brian Becker of the Socialist program.
Oh, yeah.
Brilliant.
Talking about, the New York Times and so on. That was fun. Basically, I spend my day reading, writing, and making a mess of things. So here it is. Here we are together.
Something for us all to aspire to. Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, we love this. We both love the Socialist program on here. Highly recommend anybody who's listening to that. If you want to get some news, you want to get some more serious analysis, not just talking about media and stuff. If you want to go that direction, go definitely check that out. But we appreciate having you on our show. Have you seen any good movies recently? Read any good books? What is your how's that been? What have you been into?
Okay, let's just go straight to it then, shall we?
Go straight to it. Yeah.
I saw the Flash movie, and
Okay.
I don't know what people think of movies like that, but I found it really, really interesting
Okay.
for several reasons. You see, one of the interesting things with fiction is it allows you to think about, the possibilities in history, things that could have happened or might happen in the future. In a way, it allows you to stretch your imagination. If you could do that, how would you deal with it? What are the ethics of behavior? What are the limits? Well, what's interesting about this film, it's about a young boy, really, whose mother is killed, and his father is blamed for the murder, and his father is in prison. And he grows up without his mother, whom he loved, and with the belief that his father didn't commit the crime of killing the mother. So, he discovers accidentally that he has all these powers because he gets hit by lightning. And they're extraordinary powers. Well, I like, firstly, just to say the idea of a person having extraordinary powers, because, what the capitalist system does, and I'll come back to the movie in a bit.
Sure, go for it. Yeah.
100%.
What the capitalist system does is it really takes away our sense that we're each quite special, that we have power, in other words, or powers. You can have the singular power of the people and so on, but also powers, the ability to run super fast, or the ability to jump or fly, or, hit people and they collapse, maybe you have Muhammad Ali was a superpower guy, he could clobber you or whatever, but really not, because that's a sport. So there's something interesting about these films like Flash or Superman or Batman, where, let's leave Superman out because Superman is different. Superman comes from another planet.
Sure.
But where somebody discovers a power, like Flash, just an ordinary kid sitting in a lab late at night, there's a storm and a flash of lightning strikes and there's chemicals in front of him and he gets struck with those chemicals and he gets a power, an incredible power,
Right.
move beyond the speed of light, really. Okay. So suddenly an ordinary kid has powers, that's interesting. That's a fantasy of every jerk who has to survive in the capitalist system,
Right.
It's like every jerk wants to have powers of some kind, Look at what people do to their cars or what they do, to their bodies. They tattoo themselves with emblems of superpowers,
Right.
lightning strikes. You got a car with a lightning, or I can drive as far. No, you can't. You really can't, because there's a speed limit and the cop will pull you over and harass you. And, you might go to jail and so on. But I can do it. I have a power. I'm greater than that person who goes into an office and is mistreated. And here comes Superman, because, Clark Kent comes from Krypton, Jael comes from Krypton, whatever. But he's a schmuck, man. He's insulted by everybody in the office.
Yeah.
He's the guy that they're like, hey, Clark, you got your glasses on,
He never gets
He's
the girl.
that
Yeah.
1950s dweeb, I guess in American culture, he'd be the dweeb character.
Yeah.
But really, he can go into the closet or the phone booth and he emerges as Superman.
Right.
There's something there that's attractive, I think, to ordinary people about the Marvel, landscape is this ability of pretty regular folk to have something happen to you. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, it's the toxic slime that gives them it's the flotsam of capitalism in contradiction suddenly gives them power. They become these incredible ninja turtles who can talk, and do and have adventures and so on. So the Flash is like that. Now, the interesting ethical dilemma is he goes back in time. He can run so fast, he can beat the clock, and he can turn time back. It's not actually a new idea because, we had that already in the Superman films. Fly like that and you can turn back.
The very first one,
in the 70s,
right, to save Lois Lane and so on. Anyway, he goes back and he tries to change history. Now, we know, actually, very interesting, that there's a lot of literature, including Star Trek, which says don't get involved. Remember, the first ordinance of Star Trek is do not get involved. You can
they always break it in those episodes.
Exactly.
They always do.
Ordinance,
Yeah,
and it's almost like an ordinance to society. Don't try to change history. It's what it is, guys. Don't get involved. But this kid tries, and he messes things up, and he keeps having to go back, and he discovers himself. Even this is a spoiler.
That's fine.
He's himself.
Been out for a while.
Has to stop himself because nobody else can. And I found it quite interesting because it tells you a lot about the philosophy of history. Does one have the right to intervene? Okay, the three of us, I don't know about you, but I don't know how to change time. I don't know how to go back.
Haven't figured it out myself. No,
still working on that.
Figured it out. The time machine. Every kid in an industrial society had some box sitting somewhere in their room, which they pretended was their either time machine or spacecraft. Which is basically the same thing.
No doubt.
But in a way, this does raise questions. Do I have the right to change history? Do ordinary people have the right to intervene, to organize, to build movements? It actually raises bigger questions than people who just dismiss these films, okay? Because when you walk out of the film, you're thinking, was it okay for Flash to have gone back to try to protect his father and save his mother? Was that okay? Or was it not okay? Those are existential questions, Is it okay to imagine that, those of us who are basically the jerks of capitalism, getting jerked around, in other words, by the system, do we have the right to try to change things, And so, yeah, man, I think that film, for me, that made me think more. I haven't seen the Oppenheimer movie. I'm going to see it. But I think that film made me think about things more than maybe even the Oppenheimer film, which kind of is a slam dunk for me. The guy was a jerk. The bomb was a fucking, it's a weapon of mass destruction. But the Flash made me think, man, if I had the ability to go back, what would I change?
Right.
Would it be something personal, in my history? I have things in my own history that I'm not happy with, things that happened to me or things I did. Or do I go back and do I assassinate Hitler? Would that have changed anything? The one person killed, I don't know if it would have changed a lot, but could have changed something. What can I do? Go even further back, beg Judas, don't betray this guy, Jesus, man, he's a hell of a speaker. Let him go out there and talk this socialist ideas.
I'll give you 40 pieces of silver.
Yeah.
Man, Judas, take it easy, dude. You really need to betray this guy. He's a good speaker, do I do that? I'm just saying that this idea of acting in history, whether in the past or in the present or even in the near future, do we have a right? And movies like that make you think that. And I hope people think and reflect on this and feel some confidence. Oh, shit, I have the right to act,
Right.
I don't have to be a spectator in history.
Absolutely.
Well,
Go ahead, Josh.
kind of an you bring up Superman. Kind of an example of that on the Marvel end is Spider-Man. He's just a kid. He's just a working class kid, at least in his original incarnation, right? He's bitten by a spider. He's got super strength. What's the first thing his uncle teaches him? With great power comes great responsibility, right? So that's the thing. If it's you're led to. I mean, it's kind of the blade itself inciting to deeds of one type or another, right? You have this thing, you want to do something with it, right? But you have to have a guiding principle in life. You have to be willing to help clean up the mess, essentially. But what does that look like? What does that mean, right? And the way that the story unfolds, I think, leads to, you're correct, something, really interesting stuff in one direction or another.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Spider-Man, because old Spidey is a classic example of exactly what I would say. Is a better example in a way even than Flash, because, they're actually similar. Flash is a lower middle class kid. Spidey was like a working class kid. It's very similar.
Journalist, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, something happens to you. It's imposed on you, this power. And then you have to think, how do I do it? Well, a lot of comics turn the superhero against the criminal. It's interesting. It's like the underworld,
Mm-hmm.
In Batman, it's a penguin. It's the diabolical figure, it's the Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
It's the Muammar Gaddafi. It's the Vladimir Putin, it's this. That's where these comic books get super conservative, because the enemy isn't, say, the capitalist system. Now, there are contradictions, correct? Because even in Batman, there are contradictions. There is the system. Batman himself, again, another story of parents being killed, and why, and what's the story, and you never really get it. I mean, Christopher Nolan, and I mean, these people who make these films are interesting people, but they are also saturated in contradictions.
Oh, no doubt.
They are not. It's not like these are quote unquote socialist films, but neither are they fully imperialist films. That's what I'm saying, is that they're saturated in contradictions, but see how they smuggle in conservative ideas. It's the one bad guy. If you get the penguin, then you saved humanity, the Joker. And so look how the parallel works in US foreign policy.
Sure.
There's always a Joker or a penguin that they want to go after. Assad must go. Saddam must go. I mean, for God's sake, guys, the world is more complicated than XYZ must go. That is why anarchist politics of like assassinating a person never really advances a project. Look at the United States. So many presidents have been assassinated. Okay.
Right.
It's actually quite surprising how many presidents have been assassinated, but the structure remains intact.
Yes.
And there's a trivial way in which this idea exists, get the Joker and everything's gone. Doesn't work like that, man. The structure is far deeper, and you got to build mass movements for structural transformation. That requires patience and so on. Very hard to make a film about that. I mean, I'm going to put it there that, I've seen a lot of quote unquote socialist directors making films about class struggle and, strikes. Matewan, for instance, amazing film by John Sayles. There's a ton of British directors who make working class films, but it's a hard film to make, to show a revolution. The painstaking, boring work of structural transformation. You can look at a film like Reds, which was, I don't know if you've seen Reds, very inspiring movie made by Warren Beatty based on John Reed's book. But really, that movie is not about revolution. The revolution is the background. It's about a heroic character who's John Reed. It's about heroism. But look at what Warren Beatty does, which I found cool, is he starts the movie with veterans of the US communist movement talking about their memories of John Reed and their own work as American communists. It's a very moving opening. It still doesn't, as a plot, doesn't show you how to change things fundamentally. So you end up, because of the 2.5 hour length, you end up with this extremely interesting character, Flash, Spider-Man, and so on. But they can only confront the one bad individual.
Right.
Because it's too complicated to have Spidey take on capitalism.
Mhm. It's interesting because we were talking about this not too long ago, that it is much easier for media to maybe have a criticism of the system than it is for it to present the creation of something new or how you could actually structurally transform. There's a lot of stuff that could be interpreted as broadly anti-capitalist or anti-greed, at least, or whatnot, in these movies and books and TV. But then when it goes on to what's the next step, it very often is seen as, oh, that's too far, or that's just as bad, or whatever. You have the example of, we talked about Black Panther, like his his radical enemy, his his solution to imperialism is shown as just as bad or even worse. Or you see something like the Hunger Games, where the people who are revolting, it's like, well, they use violence, so they're just as bad as the oppressors. And so that's a subtle way that, even this sort of anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist, if it even is that, fiction can have these more subtle narratives. And I don't think it's always this intentional plot or anything by the creators. I think they're just so steeped in a capitalist society that happens. Not to say that there haven't been State Department plots to put things in movies and stuff, because there certainly has as well. But what are your thoughts on that? Like the idea of selling someone anti-capitalism without exactly bringing them to the revolution, to a transformation.
Yeah, man. I mean, firstly, let's just acknowledge it's really hard to make a film. I don't mean
no doubt,
getting financing and all of that. I don't mean any of that. I just mean it's really hard to even write a screenplay.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think often of Boots Riley. And Boots made a really super anti-capitalist film,
Sorry to bother you, yeah?
Sorry to bother you. It's incredible.
Quite good.
It has a weird ending. Why? Because suddenly there are horse people and so on. But it's a really profound movie about people who work in call centers and they're just the degradation of capitalism. But then the capitalist in it is a pretty pathetic character, and in the end, this movie sort of fizzles out for me. I thought it was a terrific film, and I sympathize with Boots, because how do you end a movie like that? Well, let's create a horseman in the basement. Sure. And that's so weird. People will be like, what the hell? But then how do you end the movie? The only way to end the movie is to get your own against the guy who owns that one shop. That's really the limit of how we learn to portray, capitalism. I don't see anything beyond that. Go back to an earlier film, one of the great Union films of all time, Salt of the Earth, which is one of the only movies banned in the United States, made in the middle of an actual miners' strike in the southwest of the US, where the actors in the movie were families of the miners. It's a great film. But in the end of the movie, it has to end, either with the victory or the defeat of the miners. You can't, there's no way to pull the lens back and say we're talking about capitalism and socialism. We're talking about this struggle, mate one, over here. It gets defeated, it wins. It gives you a sense of the power of participation and so on. And to my mind, that's fine. That's enough. You see, what can art do? Socialist art, what can it do? What should it do? In our time, it's my view that socialist art has to cut through the sense of alienation and isolation people have, that feeling. And here's the ironic thing, is while I love superhero movies kind of reinforce the isolation and the atomization. Because end of the day, it's not like the people are acting. It's like Spidey saves the day, or Batman or Superman or whoever, and that Zionist, Wonder Woman saves the day, whatever.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's always the individual who saves the day, the hero. So, I mean, I love those films and they excite me and so on. And they're exciting partly because of this idea that even we ordinary schmucks can develop a superpower. But why can't our superpower be the power of organizing? The power, why can't, okay, some years ago, a friend of mine gave me a fantastic comic book, which is that Superman, or Jor-El, before he becomes Superman, his pod lands in the USSR, doesn't land in Ohio, wherever the hell it lands. It lands somewhere in the middle of the USSR. And this guy becomes a communist Superman with a big hammer and sickle and whatever. It's a pretty funny comic. It's actually I think, a Marvel spin-off comic. It's not some radical, but it's pretty funny because it's a premise, right?
Yeah.
It does. The Earth is spinning, and the pod ends up, 20 minutes later than it did enter Earth's atmosphere, and then it goes to the USSR. Doesn't have to be hours later because it takes time. Anyway.
Oh yeah.
So there it is, but even there, it then became a Cold War comic, about Superman versus the superheroes of the West. It's a Cold War comic. I think it's really hard to produce art in our social situation that reveals something of socialism. It's really hard. It's not easy. I think it's easier to produce anti-capitalist art, particularly nowadays, when the confidence in socialism is so low and the social imagination to grasp socialism so low. It's much easier to do anti-capitalist art. So I don't have such a harsh criticism of, friendly filmmakers and so on. I think they're doing the best they can in this context. Now, we should still keep discussing and thinking, well, how do we make a better story? Like, what's a way to tell the story of socialism that's going to inspire people to get organized? What's the best way? In a way, and I once met the guys who made the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In a way, that premise could have gone in a socialist direction, because remember, it's not one guy. They're a group.
Team, yeah.
It's a team, and maybe they could get other people into their team. They don't, though, it just stops at, what is it, the 4 of them or 5 of them. Why can't they go out there and get more people into their team, bring them into the sewers, train them? They don't have to have superpowers. They can train not only turtles, but other animals and so on, and then lead a rebellion. Could be interesting. But again, it sounds dumb when I say it, and that's because our horizon is narrowed, that it sounds dumb and predictable. And, one last thing I'll tell you, there was a terrific Hindi movie from the 70s, I think, called Garam Hawa, which means the warm wind. The movie is about a Muslim family in India deciding not to go. Well, some of the family members go to Pakistan, some stay in India. In the last scene, this guy who decides not to go to Pakistan gets off a horse cart. He's in the city, leaves his home, and he walks down the road, and then he turns the corner and he runs into a massive communist demonstration. And the last scene of the movie, he just walks into that demonstration. And the movie follows not him, follows the march, and then the movie ends. That's a beautiful, beautiful ending, because he just enters into that kind of line of history, as it were. But it's like a deus ex machina, it's like the spacecraft that comes from somewhere and just takes you off. It's unexpected. It's not in the narrative flow of the film. But I just don't know how to. As I say, we are blocked. History is not allowing us to produce this new, genuinely socialist art that is not merely anti-capitalist.
It's difficult to go back, and that's what I think we should drill down and do in the near future of the pod, is try and go back and drill down into, because there does exist American proletarian fiction, but I'm struggling to think of a genuine media story, property, material of that stripe in today, right? Because today it's all about, as you say, the superhero. It's all about the protagonist. Who are we following? Whose desires are we? You can have one struggle or another that's the backdrop of that, right? But yeah, I'm genuinely struggling to come up with a really populist oriented. Are you familiar with the film Black Klansman?
No, I was thinking of going to see it, but then something happened. I was traveling, and by the time I came back, it had gone. And I love seeing films in film theaters, frankly.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
I hate watching it on my computer. I mean, I do it.
It's not the same, though.
It's not films like that. So I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Yeah. But tell me about it.
Yeah, I mean, you really gotta, some films are big screen movies, some are not. I mean, this you can make the argument, but it's about it's in the 70s, I believe. It's based on a true story about a black man who was the first black police officer in Colorado Springs. And he does this sort of sting operation, infiltrating the KKK over the phone and pretending to be a white man, basically, and busting a big old like a white supremacist ring in the area. It's a really interesting movie. I like it a lot. It makes up for Spike Lee's remake of Old Boy, TBH. But it's weird because what you said about films that can have a critique of the existing system, right, without necessarily articulating an alternative, sort of twig that in my mind, because it has a lot of really intelligent things to say about how reactionaries sort of build their movement outside the sort of mass base of things, and pull off infiltrations and whatnot. But it doesn't really prescribe a mass base like alternative to that. Like ultimately the heroes are, the one good cop that sort of rallies people and pulls off a purge, right? So it does kind of fall down on that front, especially in the context of the policing discourse in this country today. So it's a limitation that you sort of go in there unable to kind of shake.
Yeah, I mean, let's not get into cop films because those are super interesting on their own. I mean, it's interesting that so many cop films are buddy films, one way or the other. And I don't mean like Die Hard. I also mean other cop films where it's an ensemble cast. They're all kind of pals and so on. They're all. It's very interesting because somebody could do an analysis of the unities between the cop films and the mafia films, or even the Sopranos, because there's always like these kind of Italian or Irish buddies, who are on the force. And there's something interesting about Italian and Irish working class representation, how these communities are represented. It's either the cop film or it's the sometimes the union film. I mean, if you go back and watch Wall Street, that's an interesting film because look, a film is about producing for the viewer an ethical dilemma, in my opinion. Fiction in general should awaken in you an ethical dilemma. And the film Wall Street, which is, I think, completely misremembered, because the way people remember it is, Gordon Gekko, the capitalist, greed is good and so on. But in fact, the heart of the film is about a father and son. It's about a father who's a union leader at an airport for an airline, and the son who's working for Gordon Gekko. And Gekko hires the boy knowing that this is the son of the union leader, and he wants the union to back down so he can make a deal. So now the son, has an ethical dilemma. Do I, for the sake of my own advancement, screw my dad and people I grew up with? That's the neoliberal dilemma. And that's what the film is really about. The film doesn't celebrate greed. The film is an ethnography of a dilemma, a dilemma that young working class people in many countries face. Do I betray my community for my personal gain? Or do I stand with my community? That is a tremendous socialist film. It's very interesting. It's not remembered like that. It's remembered as a kind of salutation to Wall Street. In fact, in my opinion, Wall Street is a sideshow in the film. The real dilemma is at the airport. And it's between Martin Sheen and his son. He's played in the movie by his son. And I think that's a great socialist film because it raises the fundamental ethical dilemma. And those who haven't seen Oliver Stone's Wall Street, I highly recommend it because you think you've seen that movie, but watch it again because you haven't. Most likely you've just seen clips of Gordon Gekko saying greed is good, but you haven't watched the movie. When you watch the movie, you recognize this is a class war within the class, where certain people in the class who are perhaps bright or get some advantages or whatever are able to, quote unquote, have an exit from the class. And at that moment of exit, it's a Faustian bargain. The devil has come to Faust and says, give me your soul and I'll give you immortality. And in a way, Gordon Gekko is the devil coming to this young boy and saying, give me your father's head on a plate and I'll give you a multi-million-dollar job, forever. And that's a dilemma. You're going to kill your father for the riches of the world? Are you going to sell your soul to get immortality? You're going to live the rest of your life without a soul? I have a lot of friends that went into the world of finance in the 1980s. It is a soul-crushing profession, okay? Right. Your soul is emptied. So the whole Dr. Faust, written long before finance capital is dominant, was actually quite a visionary text, provides the fundamental ethical dilemma for people under conditions of capitalism. Do you, not for the sake of survival, but for the sake of aggrandizement, do you cut a deal with the devil? My aunt used to ask me when I got involved in the left movement, she would say, son, what's your price? At what price will you sell out to the devil? What price? And socialists need to ask themselves their price, but it's not about socialists. It's a civilizational and cultural issue. What's the culture teaching us? Across countries like the United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, Germany, these old industrialized countries, the richer countries, it's a question to ask, is it worth selling out your class for your personal aggrandizement? And having sold out your class, how do you live with yourself? How do you live with yourself? Well, the film Wall Street really picks it up. But again, so do a lot of these, lesser films. I say lesser, by which I mean they are more kind of pulp films, the Marvel type films and so on. They also raise, in a different way, this fundamental ethical question of how do you want to live in the world?
Absolutely. I have you heard of the book? We talked about it on the show some months ago, but there is a book, and it's truly terrible, as you might imagine. It's a novel written by Bill Clinton. Have you heard of it? The President is Missing. It's quite bad, as you might expect.
Okay. Firstly, I would like to just say, for the record, that George W. Bush has become a painter of art, including a portrait of himself naked in the bathtub.
It's
I don't know if you've seen that particular piece of fine art.
Unfortunately, I have.
I believe Hillary Clinton has written a mystery novel.
And now, so has Bill Clinton.
I'm told. And it comes, therefore, as no surprise to me that Big Bill, in his time of retirement, has written a piece of crap. He was a piece of crap president.
Oh, yeah.
And so surprised that he's written a piece of crap book. But tell me about this book, because I have never going to read it.
You shouldn't. We only read it so we could, talk about it. And even then it was quite a skim, but it makes it interesting. It comes at this question you're talking about from a direction that, I would say a normal person would never think, which is it's the story of this president who got where he is from nothing. And this president in the novel, which is very much a self-insert character for Bill, because he's still a deeply insecure man, despite having all his accomplishments. It basically takes the stance that you should do everything. You should sell everyone out. This guy has sacrificed everything, is willing, and it presents it as a greater good. And I thought it was, while I would never recommend anyone reading it, it was such an interesting look into the mind of like the capitalist class and the political elite class, this idea of, no, anyone can make it. You just have to be willing to sell your soul. And so when we see films like Wall Street or another film similar to that, Wolf of Wall Street, a film that shows all this degradation, shows how miserable these people are. A movie like maybe American Psycho comes to mind as well. Someone shows how fundamentally miserable the people at the top are, how soulless, how unimportant. It actually comes at it from the direction of, oh no, this is good. And it's really depraved and terrible. But I was just thinking on it while you were talking about that, because it's just this story of this guy who rises to the top, and then, he's the hero. He saves the country from a terrorist operation. The president himself fights off the attackers. He was also a Major League Baseball player, and all the women like him. It's very embarrassing.
Oh my God,
it would never
Bill.
have been. It would not have been published. It would not have been published if he was not independently famous. Deeply embarrassing book. But it is interesting to see that the sort of the psychology at the heart of the capitalist class, when
and it's nuts because, right, it's not written ironically at all. It's written completely straight,
I'd have written it as a joke, like a satire.
right. But its target is, Clinton's fanboys, right? The Clintonite sort of liberals of this country who, there's a scene toward the end where, the American president and the Israeli prime minister and the German chancellor are all kind of getting together at the president's billionaire friend's like a compound in West Virginia to figure out how to solve the problem. And I'm reading this like, for a certain type of person, this is like the Avengers,
right? Yeah.
It's crazy to me that, but what you said interested me about genuinely intelligent, perhaps even genuinely socialist media that raises those interesting questions, right? But might get misconstrued, right? I'm thinking, American Psycho is another great example. I'm thinking Fight Club, these people who, for a certain type of person, you look at them and they're like, yeah, they go in, you're Tyler Durden's and you're Patrick Bateman's, right? They do what they want, they mess stuff up, and they sort of don't see past that surface and that disruptive surface, right? And what do you do with people who look at Starship Troopers and think, yeah, military is really cool, and kind of look past that message of, well, why are we sending a generation into a meat grinder, right? It's that sort of discursive environment where this stuff gets completely turned on its head, right? I'm not saying, the CIA bankrolled the spread of 1984, the publication of that, for example. I'm not saying that happens all the time, but it's these very convenient narratives that spring up around otherwise really interesting media, even if the media themselves aren't necessarily revolutionary.
Well, the first thing is that, of course, no artist can control how their message is taken.
No doubt.
That's
Death
without
of the author,
a doubt, right?
Mhm.
Okay, I don't know, this may have just been something you missed, but if you watched the US version of House of Cards, which is in a way a kind of composite character of every liberal president from Clinton onward, it's really a kind of Clinton, actually,
Sure.
a Southern guy, killed somebody, there's a kind of Clinton sleaze there.
Yeah.
But I wonder how many, if you ask people who's your favorite character in House of Cards, the US version, how many people would pick, the president? I think a lot of people would pick the president, or maybe his wife, who's equally diabolical, and so on. Why would they pick them? Why? In a way, because they're successful. And there's a success bias in a capitalist society. That's just the nature of things. That's why, these superhero films are interesting, because it's like Spider-Man, working class kid bitten by a spider, but then the success bias works in his favor, that the guy can do all these amazing things. You want to be like him. You don't want to be, like the people who are standing outside the gates of the White House in the House of Cards show protesting. Those people look like idiots.
Right. They look unimportant. Yeah.
Yeah, they're going to do that. Then they're going to go back to their houses. They're going to eat some miserable meal, and they don't even allow themselves to smoke at the window and look so cool,
Yeah.
And so on, So there's a success bias in a capitalist society when it comes to fiction, non-fiction. When you look at the British version of House of Cards, it was only 3 episodes. Super different.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Not seen
The prime minister does all those things. He seduces a young journalist, has to kill her. The first season of the US one is a complete ripoff of the British House of Cards, only 3 episodes. But the British House of Cards has an underlying thing, which is that these people are nasty. There's an underlying, because British society has a much more class conscious attitude. This elite is nasty. This is the Thatcherite elite. Fuck them, So that was more hard-boiled, anti-Thatcherite kind of feeling. Now, you can watch the movie and actually sympathize with the prime minister, just to tell you that there is not this direct, you can't control this. On the other hand, from my perspective, more interesting than what okay, when you go to see a movie, right? Most people, I don't know if everybody, you go see a movie with a few of your friends, right? What's the best part of the movie? It's not the movie, man. It's when you go to the bar or get an ice cream or whatever, and the 4 of you are sitting around a table arguing about the film, right?
Yeah.
That is the
what
best
that meant.
political
Yeah.
education,
Sure.
That's a real political school right there, And, I personally, and you get a lot of intellectual stimulation. It's funny, you sometimes wish that high school literature classes would be like that, bar room atmosphere after a film.
Sure.
Where everybody's chatting and there's nobody there who's telling you you're wrong. A lot of high school education is the teachers like, that's a wrong interpretation. Whereas when you're in the bar with your friends, people just gang up on each other saying, that's bullshit. You're so different
Yeah.
from saying from a position of authority. That's wrong.
Mhm.
When I was in school, I was in a literature group, a bunch of friends. We'd read books, we'd argue. I loved that. It made
Mhm.
me love reading, in fact. So, in fact, yeah, man, the film can't dictate anything. It's the after film conversations and discussions. And I often feel that, like we judge a movie, I walk out of, let's say, I don't know, oh man, I went to see that great film about the one solitary Scandinavian guy who kills all the Nazis. It was an amazing film. I've forgotten the name. It's some Norwegian or Finnish movie with one word, whatever. Super good film, Like this guy, they hang him and he finds a nail underneath his foot on the post and he stands on the nail.
Oh, wow.
I mean, the guy never, it's like John Wick, okay? Another
Mhm.
film series I love. I've watched John Wick 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the same movie. Each
Mhm.
of the movies of John Wick is the same. But John Wick is amazing. You want to be him. You want to be that guy who takes on all the villains of the world. With what? With like, not, he doesn't even have guns. He
He doesn't
takes
need them.
people's
Yeah.
guns. He doesn't need them.
Finds a
He
stapler
falls
to
out
throw
of
at him or
the
something. Yeah.
fourth floor hotel window and he just gets up and walks. I mean,
Uh-huh.
John Wick, man, you don't even need to be bitten by a spider. You're just awesome. You're
Mhm.
amazing. So what I'm trying to say is that, these films, this film, this Nazi solitary guy who goes and blows everybody up, John Wick, whatever, they create a lot of excitement in you and you're dying to talk about the film to your friends. And we underestimate the power of that democratization of art, where the viewers argue with each other. What I would do? I wouldn't spend, if I had a lot of money, I wouldn't spend the money making a film right now. But I would design a new kind of film theater, where the point wasn't that you buy popcorn and soda and go and take it in and watch it in the film and then go home. But you come in, you watch the film, and then there's a bar right there or something, some way to capture you so you're arguing and discussing. And people can't say, I'm tired, I'm going home.
Mhm.
You go to see a movie with a friend and they're like, I'm tired, I'm going home. No, man, the movie starts now.
Mhm.
When the
Right.
lights go on in the theater, that's when the movie starts, man. Don't say, I'm tired, I want to go home. That's when you've got to sit down with a bunch of friends and that's the political education about culture,
Mhm.
and that's why I don't like watching movies often on my thing. I like to go to the movie theater, like to
Mhm.
feel the vibe of other people and so on. It democratizes art, conversation democratizes art.
Yeah, even a fundamentally like less than interesting or not that good quote unquote movie can be a lot more enjoyable when you experience it with someone. Or it doesn't have to be a movie, it can be any piece of art because it's a social experience and we're social animals, and that's a great thing. And that's a thing that capitalism often takes from us. And I think it also turns these avenues of conversation, it tries to push them into spaces like online and things like that. And that's not always necessarily bad, but it can become toxic in a way that face-to-face conversations show so rarely is. In my experience, for sure. But like even like I saw Barbie the other day. It was a really goofy movie. Me and my friends dressed up as the different Barbies and Kens to go see it. We had a lot of fun. Got talking with someone in the theater afterwards, and we just like went back and forth on it. And that's an interesting movie because it has some like criticisms of patriarchy and stuff in it. But then at the end of the day, it kind of exists to sell products for the Mattel Corporation. So that's another movie that's full of contradictions. But, in that moment, it's not about the Mattel Corporation. It's about the guy next to you who's wearing a funny costume and you're wearing a funny costume, and you talk and say, I liked this, I didn't like this. That would be interesting. Absolutely. And that's
But wait a
social
minute, that
aspect is
movie is
important.
also Ryan Gosling. So,
That's true.
Ryan Gosling is amazing.
He is
So
good. He's quite good in it.
whatever,
Mhm.
he's good
He's
in all the movies. I mean, the thing is, there are some actors that I just think are amazing, whether they act or not. Okay.
sure.
I think he's just,
Hmm.
I
Did you
haven't
see?
seen it
Did
yet,
you see?
but no, I
He
mean,
has a dance number in it. It's very funny.
I gotta see
He's
it.
very funny in it.
I
I
could
mean,
go and see it.
mhm.
I'm in Santiago. I could go see it, but it would be in Spanish. And I
Uh,
don't know. I wonder what the Barbie movie would be like in Spanish. That's a very,
Different. An
by
interesting
itself,
experience.
an ethnographic experience.
No doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Cillian Murphy is another actor like that. Who, I mean, he's in Oppenheimer, right? But he's also in
Also in Batman.
yeah, in Batman. He's
So
in
was Margot Robbie. If you think
Oh,
about it,
you're
both
right.
Batman villains, and they're both in the big movie. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
The
Just
crossover,
came to
yeah.
think of it.
He's in a really good movie called The Wind That Shakes the Barley that I watched back in 100%. It's about
Great movie.
Irish Civil War and how, it's not over just the fight isn't over just because the revolution has succeeded or partially succeeded, depending on where you fall on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's such a good movie. Also, the name of the movie is so good.
Yes.
The Wind That Shakes the Barley. Because what? Why? What is it saying to us? That, you organize against the system, you want to change the wretchedness of the system and all that. And then this wind starts to blow,
Yeah.
And I always say, that's Lenin's What Is to Be Done. You build the barley, you build the stock, you build the organizations, but you have to prepare for the wind.
The
That's
objective
what
condition,
you're
yes.
preparing for. You keep doing struggles to bring more and more people and so on, and then the wind comes. The wind that shakes the barley. That's a revolution, man. That's what it's also shouldn't be misunderstood that the barley evokes the wind. You build the barley, you call the wind.
Yeah. Trees, when you plant trees, it pulls in rain. For a long time, people didn't realize that. In fact, I read a great article about how natives, when Europeans came over, said the trees call the rain, and they called them savages and called them backwards. Turns out about 150 years later, they learned the trees do call the rain. And that's exactly right there. The building, the growing is calling the conditions as well, which is why organizing is so important. I mean, Joss and I both organize on a daily or do organizing work on a daily basis. And I get asked, hey, this isn't the revolution. You're working to get rent control. You're working to whatever. And it's like, yeah, but we're teaching people how to fight, and we're teaching ourselves how to fight, because I got a hell of a lot to learn. We all do. So that's like a great point. I'm glad you bring that up. I didn't even make that connection with the movie. I need to rewatch it, honestly.
No, it's an amazing movie. But by the way, again, I just want to repeat, it's basically Lenin 1903, what is to be done.
Yeah.
And I very much appreciate what you said about the trees bringing the rain, because it is that dialectic. On the one side, we work to build the forest, and then we wait for the rain to come, but also the building the forest is calling the rain. And the combination of the forest and the rain, in a way, is the revolutionary moment. Or when the wind shakes the barley, that's the revolutionary moment. And why do we have leadership that needs experience and so on? Is you also have to be able to detect, is this the right moment? I mean, or are we misreading the moment? I mean, that's a in the middle of the Russian Revolution, Lenin wrote a beautiful little piece that's little read, called Insurrection is an Art. He said it's not a science, it's an art. To know when to act, it's an art form, it's not a science. Well, what is the difference between science and art? Science is something that where reality can be calibrated. You can measure it, you know that it's repeatable and so on. An art or a moment of artistry is not calibratable, repeatable, and so on. It requires, judgment. Judgment is something you shape through experience. It's a pretty interesting way to understand, those ideas, whether you can bring those ideas into art or not, whether it's possible. I have great sympathy for art precisely because it's not repeatable. Even people say, well, those films are formula films, Marvel films. I don't agree. All stories have a formula. There's a tragedy, and then there's struggle, and then there's either recuperation or further tragedy. There's always a kind of cliche, or rather, there's always a set piece. You can't have a movie that's completely original. It's not possible. Humans tell 8, 9 different varieties of stories. The question isn't that. It's the magic inside it. It's not that, you can just repeat the same formula. In India, sometimes people disparagingly call Indian cinema formula films. I think that's very unfair. Because those films are not all, there's some formulaic things, that are there. As I said, all the John Wick films are the same. In every film, he has to fight somebody in a gallery of mirrors. That's imperative. Well, that's also because it's really cool filmmaking.
Yeah, it's fun to
with
watch.
the mirrors and the gun, the bullets, and the Japanese fighting weapons and so on. And Keanu Reeves, man, the guy, completely, he's found his métier, from when you say from Speed, where he was great, but he was like a robot almost. But then with the Matrix films, and then with John Wick, he's discovered his métier, which is flat, almost perspectiveless character. And he's amazing at it. Well, but that's what he's really good at. He's always been that guy. Well, I don't, that's who he is. And he's great at it. And those are true. But it's not a formula, because each of them has a certain spark. And there's a different kind of intensity that comes in, and that's judgment, that requires what Kant calls judgment. A very important part of the analysis of art and so on is the world of judgment. And judgment isn't what the viewer brings to the movie. Judgment is also happening inside the film, or in the novel or whatever. There are moments of declaration, ethical dilemmas, closures, opening, false closures, where people falsely solve dilemmas. You say, hey, listen, that's not a solution. The television show Succession, for instance, one false closure of ethical dilemmas after the other. And that's a really interesting show, because you oscillate between support of Shiv, Logan, Kendall. I hate them all.
Sure.
Then again, Shiv, Logan, Kendall. I hate them all. I can't believe I'm sucked into this. I don't give a shit about these big corporations. Where are the workers? No, but I'm with Kendall. I mean, these are all false closures of ethical dilemmas. And, that's judgment.
I feel the same way about, have you seen Righteous Gemstones before?
No.
It's a show about a mega church family. It's a similar kind of thing where they're competing for power. And it's, very much a criticism of, capitalist evangelicalism. But you do actually get engaged in the story. It's like, wait, is the Walton Goggins character going to come out with his Bible game show? Is he going to win? Or is it, and it's all cynical on its face, but it's, it's a lot of, interesting to watch it play out. But absolutely. Okay. Well, I really, I appreciate that perspective you're bringing to that. That's like a lot of interesting things to think about. One thing I will note is that talking about that creativity, even in films that we consider more or less formulaic, like even if we consider them, stock films, quote unquote, like Marvel films, there is still a lot of human elements in that, which is part of the reason we got to support these strikes that are going on for the writers, for the actors, and all labor action on that to sort of fight against, encroaching artificial intelligence on these jobs. Obviously greed, the more the producers get their hands in things, the less creativity is going to be able to come to the fore. So if you like good movies, you like good books, you like good games, whatever your preferred media choice is, you should want more creativity and less capitalism in those things. I think that is pretty intuitive, but it's still a thing that, bears repeating, because I think capitalists often see these as just a way of making money. Whereas this art is a thing as old as humanity itself, really. I mean, way back to cave paintings and all that,
Yeah, and it can't be automated. AI doesn't have comedic timing. AI doesn't have, personal, history, trauma experience to draw from. It has what other people have created, and it regurgitates that, right? It can, broken clocks, it can hit certain notes, but it doesn't have, there's no genuine element. There is no struggle that birthed it. It is just a construct entire.
No, I'm really happy you mentioned that, because this is a global issue. This idea of what happened in the last maybe 35 odd years is copyright has become such an important battlefield of essentially appropriation of intellectual labor of workers to companies. And now companies hold copyright. I'll give you an example. The other day, I saw an academic book which online, which was for sale for, I think, $750. $750, one book, 57,000 rupees for those who are interested, $750. And I was thinking, how much did the writers get? Because these are all professors. They probably work for free.
Yeah.
That is to say, their college salaries cover the research and the writing and all of that. And because the book is so expensive, it's going to go to libraries and whatever. And if there are royalties, they're not going to come to the writers. Very unlikely, very small royalty. So this appropriation of intellectual labor and then intellectual property contested deeply by the company is something that has really turned the tide. I understand when musicians say we're getting off Netflix, because, not Netflix, Spotify, because, we don't get a good deal. I very much am with them. But I also think it's kind of tragic because, see what happens. Spotify is a monopoly, basically, okay? I listen basically to, when I'm on the road, I'm a Spotify guy.
Yeah.
I can't say anything else to you because where the hell else am I going to go to, like MySpace, or where am I going to listen to music?
Yeah,
download it, pirate sites, it just takes too much effort. Okay.
Cassette tape, no, not happening.
Yeah, I'm too old to be spending hours downloading, from some pirated, I don't know, websites, whatever. I'm not doing that. I'm going to just go to Spotify.
Right.
It's way easier. So the problem here isn't that Neil Young says, I'm out of Spotify. The problem is that Spotify is a monopoly. And why can't we have Spotify be like a public utility? Why can't the United Nations own Spotify? And they basically transfer profits to the performers and, don't make a profit. Have it be a not-for-profit international music streaming system. Netflix. Why doesn't the United Nations take over Netflix and Spotify?
Put them all together, all the HBO, lump them all in.
All of them, all the streaming services. Make my life a lot easier, frankly.
Absolutely.
Because, I watch HBO Max, okay? I feel guilty a little bit, saying, well, I had to buy a subscription. But what choices do we have? People say, well, why don't you watch on YouTube? Even there, you have to buy films. It's not free. You want to watch a film, you have
goes
to
to Google,
subscription, or you have to rent the movie. It's not free. Again, you can go to some website somewhere with a VPN and watch whatever. But man, I don't have the time. B, if I'm going down in some jurisdiction from some police or whatever, I don't want to be the guy who goes down for downloading films. Okay. I would like to go down for being a Marxist, not for like Al Capone taken down for.
I was just thinking.
Okay? That's not happening with me. Okay. Let's get him because he doesn't pay Spotify. He VPNs tunnels into it. That's not going to happen. So,
Video games,
but we don't have a public discourse. And I sound idiotic saying it because we don't have a public discourse about, basically, why can't we socialize, these streaming services, bring them under United Nations or some bloody, international agency. In the 1980, in fact, the McBride Report, which is a report on international communications, suggested that the satellites for communications be effectively a public utility. Yeah. Very interesting idea. Today, Elon Musk has 4 times the number of satellites than the government of China. You talk about China's taking over the world. No, sorry. Young Elon is taking over the world. Okay. He's going to dominate internet connectivity on the African continent through his Star satellite network.
Starlink.
And then, it's scary, man.
No doubt.
But there's no room in the public debate when we talk about art and so on to talk about socializing the means of distribution. There's no conversation. Now, means of production, that's a different thing. I'm just talking about the means of distribution. Like, for God's sake, can't we get Spotify without guilt?
Yeah, I mean, the public square these days, is Twitter or X or whatever the hell it's called now.
Oh my God, another Elon Musk.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. He's fucking everywhere. Yeah, but that's the thing. It's this creeping. You bring up a very good point. It's this creeping enclosure of the commons, right? There's fewer public spaces. In the real world, there's more and more barriers going up to. There's a billion streaming services that everything is fractured into, right? And what do you do if you're not willing or if you're not able to pay for one or the other? Video games as well have a big problem with this. Institutional memory, like like if you want to play something that's from a previous console generation, good luck tracking down something that runs it, let alone the game itself, right?
Mm-hmm. And you'll get, yeah, actually, I was reading a story about a guy who downloaded a game that Nintendo no longer sells, and they sued him, even though they don't even sell it anymore. They said, no, we just don't want anyone to play it because we own it. And that's a kind of a silly example, but it's a sort of an example of how this intellectual property sort of thing works. And again, you're not seeing the people who made it back whenever getting paid for that or anything like that. No one's getting paid. No one's even using it. It's very interesting. Or like you read, Martin Scorsese now has a project to try and restore old films. You see how many films just sit in vaults and they're not even available, even on these massive streaming networks, because they don't see them as profitable. And that is, antithetical to art, and it's antithetical to the idea of art for just about as long as we've been around until this very recently.
Yeah, a human experience older than recorded history, even older than Homo sapiens sapiens, our species, right? It's, what is it now? It's siloed off, it's appropriated, it's a price has been put on something priceless, right? And what do we do with that?
Absolutely.
Well, guys, super interesting to talk art and culture with you, because it's a big break for me. From talking, economics and all the other things that have to be talked about. I would prefer to spend my whole day pretending as if we just walked out of a movie theater.
Yeah.
And we were three friends just chatting about the movie we just watched. So I think we should do this again someday.
Absolutely.
Sit down and maybe the three of us should plan ahead and watch the same movie.
That would be great.
And then,
that would be fantastic.
Right? And then sit down with different places where we are with a bowl of popcorn and a strong, bourbon and whatever Coke, and we can talk movies.
I would love to do that.
100%, yes.
Would love to do that. Before you go, Vijay, could you tell our audience what anything you'd like to plug? Anything you I know a lot of them probably already have read your work, but if there's anything you want to plug, now would be a great time to do that.
Well, I would just say that they could go to thetricontinental.org, the website, and do two things. One is we have a statement about the new McCarthyism. And I very much would like people, if they can, to sign on to it, if they agree that there's a new McCarthyism and we need to fight it. And also subscribe to our materials. You'll get an email at least once a week from us, but not much more. On the one hand, fight for our right to exist. On the other, use our stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely. I would just say I do that myself. I just signed the statement. I do subscribe to Tricontinental. I have not regretted it. You've also got some great works. Just read Washington Bullets, great book. There's quite a few. So yeah, y'all look into that. And we really appreciate you coming on, and would love to do it again sometime.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Great.
All right. The Socialist Shelf signing off.